So I'm going to do, in addition to an intro, Jason Moore, who is coming up next, I'm also going to do an outro. So Java Mustafa is not only the director of CHIP, he's also its visionary. And I think if you're spending time with Java, he's a brilliant strategic mind, and he has taken from a couple of classes informatics to a certificate program to an MA program to a PhD program, and he's building it and building it. And you can see it, and we're happy to have him as a partner at the HSL. So that's the outro part. The intro part, Jason Moore. Jason Moore is the CEO of Elite HRV, and it is both a software company and also a hardware company. As you'll see, I think he's got some devices here that we can check out. So he's going to have a demo in one of the rooms over here that you can check out as well. So HRV is heart rate variability. And for those who don't know, heart rate variability is, for many people's money, the best single variable for figuring out someone's sort of holistic health, the balance of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And so HRV is a really promising technology for digital health, and they do it right. What I like about what they do is it's free for individuals, but they pay for larger users, and they give you all the data for research side that you can use. You can actually get it, which is not always true of digital health companies, and from any device. So even though they are in the hardware company business now, they don't restrict other hardware coming into their software, all of which I like. I also like that they're an Asheville-based startup, and they'll be around for demo. So with that, Jason Moore.
Great, thanks, Brian. And he said it great, so thanks, Brian, for allowing me to come and speak to all of y'all, and thanks for y'all's time this morning. And I'll be speaking about heart rate variability, and even though I own a business that is centered around monitoring HRV and other markers and things like that, I think one of the most exciting things for me is being able to be exposed to communities like this and to be able to learn from people who are on the front lines using our tools and doing research and using it in real life and to conquer different problems and things like that. And I get to learn so much from all of those people and just help provide tools that facilitate all of that for them. And so before we get into heart rate variability, talking about the bigger picture of things, I want to give you a digital version of an old Hindu proverb. And can anybody tell me what this is? I won't be surprised if you can't. How about this? Right? Think about it. Anything? Guesses? That's a really pretty good guess. Starting to get closer, right? And so the proverb is that basically, if you take a few blind men, I don't know the exact way that it's told, and ask them to feel an elephant, and if they can't see the bigger picture of an elephant, one person might feel the tusk and explain something one way, one person might feel the skin and explain something a different way, one person might feel a different part of the elephant. And this is kind of the digital version where we can zoom in with high-resolution images and be like, what is that? And then kind of zoom out and see what the bigger picture is. And the reason why I bring this up is because it's really important when we're looking at all these technologies and zeroing in on all of these different things that we can measure and track and look at, all this big data that comes in, for example, is that we keep the big picture in mind of not only what we're trying to accomplish, but what we are as biological organisms and all of that. So that's an area that's kind of I'm passionate about. The bigger picture of human health, so to speak, and you know, really ultimately it's your mind and your body and all the symbiotic organisms that are attached to that versus the rest of the world, right? And the world is a stressful place, and this is where we start stepping towards heart rate variability. So stress comes in many forms as well, and so it can be environmental stress. This actually kind of correlates somewhat with the chart that Dr. Mustafa had up. There's environmental stress, societal stress, digestive stress, mental, physical, structural, social, emotional, and many more. I'm sure that I'm missing categories like that. But all of these have an impact on your body, and it's difficult without guidance or some sort of tracking to see where the stress is coming from when you're trying to tackle your health goals. And we are essentially adaptive biological organisms, and health issues occur when acute stress from any of those sources exceeds our chronic adaptation to that stress. So an easy example for that would be exercise. If you slowly lift heavier and heavier weights, then you'll adapt to that and be able to handle that stress more easily, versus if you just skip ahead 2 years and lift the heaviest weight that you think you'll be able to lift 2 years from now, you'll injure yourself, most likely. And that same principle can be applied to the rest of life as well. If in high school somebody asked me to come present in front of this type of audience, I might have fainted or something, I don't know. But progressively I've been exposed to speaking in front of larger and larger groups of people, and the stress of that has gone down, even though it's still there. So the other side of it is a chronic mismatch, a strong or chronic mismatch between our genes and our environment. And this is another, it's related in a way, but what we find ourselves doing nowadays is eating pseudo food and staying up late and not getting sunlight and doing all of these activities that our genes did not evolve for us to do. And so we have like a chronic mismatch between our genes and our environment that adds a lot of stress to our bodies and creates a lot of these health issues that we see springing up. So why heart rate variability? HRV, as Brian mentioned, is it's a pretty fascinating metric. It's something that I've learned a ton about over the last years, and we're still learning a ton about. But it can non-invasively measure the body's response to stress from all of these different sources. And with enough data, you can also measure or fairly accurately forecast your ability to handle more stress from different sources going forward. And it's a very systemic, big picture metric, which is what really drew me to it. I was a health coach. I have a background in information systems design and a lot of different stories from different industries. But I was drawn to heart rate variability because of this systemic, big picture nature of it. And it used to be very expensive and hard to measure and things like that. You needed an EKG device and you needed to analyze a bunch of raw data. But with the evolution of consumer electronics and sensors, as well as some of the algorithms that we have that we can put on our phones and things like that, it's now very cheap and accessible. And also that kind of opens the doors to taking short, frequent measurements very often, which opens up the doors a lot for what we can learn from it, which I'll talk more about. So, cool, got some images there. HRV 101, what is heart rate variability? It's basically the change in time between each heartbeat, and we're talking about tiny millisecond changes between your heartbeats that happen between every single beat. So in a nutshell, if people think you have a heart rate of 60 beats per minute, they might think that's 1 beat per second, but in reality it's like 953 milliseconds, 1,103 milliseconds, so like 3, I guess. But, so we're picking up these tiny changes, and then we're running different algorithms. There's many different algorithms and calculations that fall under the umbrella heart rate variability. And we're running analysis on those patterns. We're seeing patterns in those tiny changes in your heartbeat. And that ties us in, just last note on this one, is it requires a high degree of accuracy still, which is why it's been only recently that cheaper, more accessible sensors have been able to measure it. And the real fascinating thing is that when you do certain analysis on those patterns, you get insight into the autonomic nervous system, like Brian mentioned. And the autonomic nervous system is a really important part of your nervous system that controls most of the automatic processes that happen in your body. So blood sugar regulation, energy regulation, pupil dilation, digestion, sexual function, you name it, your autonomic nervous system is playing a key role in it. And by this non-invasive measure, we're able to look in and see what the autonomic nervous system is doing and how it's responding to stress from all of those different areas, right? And so, on one hand, we have the sympathetic branch that controls the fight or flight stress response. there's deeper nuance to these definitions, but it's out of the scope of a 20-minute talk. In general, the sympathetic nervous system is needed for short-term survival. Again, talking about that mismatch between our genes and our environment. We're not wired to have sympathetic activation 24/7. In a lot of cases, some people end up in that because of the stress of modern life. It's associated with stress. And then conversely, the parasympathetic nervous system controls a lot of the rest and digest activities. It helps restore, rebuild, keep us healthy over the long term. And this side is what most of us are missing in modern times is healthy parasympathetic activity, which is needed for long-term survival and health. And so today, HRV is being used by athletes, coaches, rehab facilities, doctors, sports teams, general wellness practitioners and trainers and things like that. Just a quick flavor of who's using it. And I'm just going to go through some of the research that we've been exposed to as we kind of developed our platform, and as well as what some of the research is showing ongoing uses for heart rate variability. HRV has actually been around for many decades. Actually, it's been around since humans have been around, but the use of it in research and the analysis of it has been going on for decades. But it, like I mentioned, it required pretty expensive and complex analysis. So it's evolved quite a bit in recent, especially in the past 10 years. But there's over 20,000 studies in PubMed, so pretty much anything you want to know about heart rate variability applying to X, whether that's diabetes or whatever it is you want, you can go search in PubMed and find research on it today that's been published. And it's increasing very rapidly, but there's still a lot to learn from it. So a few studies, and they're not all going to have this much text. There's some pictures in here too. But I just want to give you a flavor of some of the things that we've run into and some of the people that have been using it. In this study, 778 athletes, they found that HRV indices of autonomic nervous system activity showed strong correlation with selection for the Olympic Games for the Italian team. So basically, leading up to the Olympics, it's no surprise that most of the athletes are getting lots of physical exams, and there are lots of health data coming in for these athletes. So looking at the Italian team across all their sports, and they analyzed 778 athletes, there was a really strong predictive value for heart rate variability values and who actually made it to the Olympic Games, right? And so that's one end of the spectrum that, I just down here, I think you may get copies of the slides, I'm not sure, but just in case I put links and references to the studies that these are in if you want to read more about them. On the other end of the spectrum, heart rate variability indexes worry in individuals spanning the non-clinical to clinical spectrum. And basically what I mean by that, or what we mean by that in this study, is that worry, actually, let me just describe the study a little bit because it's really interesting. Basically what they did is they measured a bunch of physiological data about people who have clinically diagnosed psychological disorders, as well as people who don't have clinical diagnoses, right? And then they did questionnaires that quantified the level of worry that these individuals express as a separate index. And what they found is that worry actually was associated with the most robust decrease in heart rate variability, independent of clinical diagnoses of depression or anxiety and things like that. So that was kind of interesting. And they found some pretty powerful data in there. I like the work of these particular scientists. Further, kind of along the same lines, HRV provides insights into emotional and behavioral regulation impairments observed in, I think this was with children with ADHD, and may aid in delineating ADHD pathophysiology. So I'm just trying to give going back to one of those PowerPoint no-nos, going back and searching for one of your slides. this whole spectrum here of stress and how we talked about, physical would be associated a lot with those Olympic athletes, but there's obviously all of these factors for them as well, but then the mental piece for other people, structural, emotional, social, and so it's really fascinating, and when I got into it, I didn't realize how deep I was going to be going with it. And it goes so far as that HRV actually decreases pretty linearly with biological aging. And so this was actually a 24-hour measurement of heart rate variability and heart rate. And over the course of 9 decades, it correlates very strongly with aging. And so one of the things that interests people about this and what they monitor on our platform for is, well, there's things that you can do that we all know, like eating healthier, exercising, eating more, going outside more, doing things like that, that can improve your HRV values very rapidly and break you out of this mold of following everyone down the aging slide there. And so much so that there's actually this Palo Alto Longevity Prize out there that is a collaboration between a bunch of really prominent educational institutes and research institutes, as well as some corporate and industry organizations. But they're putting $1 million prize out for the team. They're allowing teams to apply to try to reverse aging or basically slow down aging. And half of the prize, $500,000 of it, depends on just improving HRV. So they chose HRV as their metric for $500,000 of that $1 million prize. And so some really big, interesting organizations behind that. And we'll see. It'll be interesting to see what kind of technology solutions come out of that. But it'll also be interesting to see if they just have people like eat right and sleep well and meditate, things like that. Maybe that team will win. We'll see. So individuals with high HRV experience less psychosocial stress than individuals with low HRV. So I kind of mentioned too, it's not only kind of like a diagnostic tool to see how much stress the body has been under, but also people with higher HRV tend to be more resilient to future stress, right? And we've actually also seen this, there's a rehab facility out in Hawaii that uses our platform, and they have work-related traumatic injury patients. And they have a 12-month window to take these people back to ready-to-work status, basically, or they lose their job. So it's a very mentally stressful or psychologically stressful process, but they're also dealing with physical injury. And they just have a small data set that they've been measuring with their patients, but what they've been able to see is that with pretty reasonable confidence, within the first 3 weeks, based on their HRV data, they can predict whether or not those patients will succeed in the 12-month program. And it's based pretty much off of simple indices that we provide automatically in our app. But the people with the lowest HRV values, with the least variability in their heart rate at rest, have lower resilience and lower likelihood to respond to treatment and things like that. So it's pretty fascinating. And then, of course, they don't just say, okay, you've got these low values, you're out of the program early. It's, what can we do? What more attention can we give to those people to help bring them up to where everyone else is? And then also on the psychosocial side, this is just another example. There's some interesting things that are gender-related, hormonal-related, depending on how you want to look at it. Females typically have higher HRV than men. And so there's hypotheses that go along with this, such as that maybe men have more sympathetic expression typically or something like that. But I just find it interesting that there are gender variations, and it could be even as much as a cultural, societal pressures that cause different things. But reduced heart rate variability, which is a marker of poor cardiac autonomic function, has been associated with air pollution, especially fine particulate matter. And so environment was on Dr. Mustafa's chart as well, right? And when I mentioned the environment earlier, mismatch between genes and environment, I didn't only mean the air and water and things like that. It's just more like everything that we interact with. But here's a direct example of the actual environment with regards to air pollution, reducing heart rate variability. And there's another study that actually digs into this a little further, which is not this one, but I linked to both of them here in case you want to read more about those. Inflammation, this is an area that's really fascinating to me because there's so many sources of inflammation today. But as measured by C-reactive protein, which is typically measured from a blood draw, it's strongly associated with decreased heart rate variability. And some interesting things that we're starting to see is that with regards to data, and we talked about big data a little bit ago, is that the fascinating thing about being able to capture more advanced type of data on a longitudinal basis, like Dr. Mustafa was saying, is that you start to get to the point where you may be able to eliminate some of the more expensive testing and some of the more invasive testing by combining really smart use of wellness questionnaires or subjective questionnaires, as well as these non-invasive markers, to where you could get to the point maybe where instead of trying to get a blood draw to measure inflammation, you could just I'll have a demo later of our little finger clip that's non-invasive. You can just measure your heart rate variability from your fingertip in 2 minutes and get just as confident of an understanding of it. Trends in both absolute HRV values and day-to-day variations may be useful measurements indicative of the progression towards maladaptation or non-functional overreaching. That's kind of the summary of this paper that was done by Dan Plews and Paul Larson and Martin Boucher and Andrew Kilding, these folks. So on the side, I also run an educational platform, which I teach courses about heart rate variability on and other subjects. And these guys are going to be teaching courses on that platform pretty soon, so we're excited about that. Martin Boucher is big in the soccer world. Paul Larson and Dan Plews, they work with New Zealand rowing, who are the gold medal rowers, and they have basically some world and national champion triathlete titles underneath them. And they find HRV to be an extremely powerful metric. In fact, Dan's thesis for his PhD was all about HRV. And so they measure this metric in the morning for a couple of minutes each day. And this is kind of that longitudinal piece. By comparing those changes in time, or changes in HRV values over time, they're able to see when their athletes are maladapting or non-functional overreaching to training, and they can rein that in or take extra steps to boost their recovery and things like that. So very powerful data to have. We don't have any agreements yet with any of the sports teams to allow us to put their logos all over our PowerPoints and stuff, but we have some really fascinating data leading up to World Cups and Olympics and things like that from athletes who have been tracking on our platform and seeing basically predictive patterns. There is one, I just did a podcast recording that we talked about it, and Ohio State Wrestling has been a really prominent wrestling team, and the sports scientist for them has been measuring HRV with the athletes for a couple of years, and he's come up with his little population. He's basically able to predict the point differential in the match based on their pre-match HRV values. In this chart, which I'm sorry you can't read, athletes exhibit higher HRV than active people. So basically, it's just to kind of indicate that there is a broad spectrum. It's not just like you're healthy or not type thing. Is that you can be pretty healthy or assumed to be above average in health if you're an active person, but athletes still exhibit pretty significantly higher HRV values, probably due to the more aerobic fitness demands that most athletes incur. And then this one, kind of on the other end of the spectrum again, is that even in the pre-diabetic stage where individuals have impaired glucose tolerance, that's associated with lower heart rate variability and decreased parasympathetic activity. It's believed that parasympathetic modulation may decline with an autonomic imbalance during the progression from normal glucose tolerance to impaired glucose tolerance and finally diabetes. And one of the things that we're doing right now, which I'm super excited about, is including more types of data in our platform so that we can add our own statistics to this journey for these types of questions. But what's the relationship between heart rate variability and blood glucose, right, and blood sugar regulation? And we have a researcher who's also going to be teaching a course for us who's looked specifically at this and done a lot of, he and his cohorts or whatever have worn continuous blood glucose monitors for months on end and measuring HRV values like 24/7 and at snapshots, and they have lots of really interesting data. I'm glad that they're the ones with all the implants and not me. It'll be interesting to see how that comes out. HRV indices are considerably lower for cancer patients than the general population. And, obviously, this isn't to say there's any cause or effect based on just this one study, but there's a lot to learn from the big picture here. I'm going to speed through this a little. I think I'm getting close to the end, but I want to be able to accept questions. This one was also, so this was after heart attacks, basically. Patients with better HRV were more likely to survive after having a heart attack than people with lower HRV. In osteopathic manual therapy, they found that manipulation of different parts of the spine actually triggered different patterns in HRV correlating with activation of different parts of the nervous system. And so like the cervical and lumbar parts of the spine seem to be more parasympathetic activating versus the thoracic being more sympathetic activating. So there's lots of ongoing research. These are actually just organizations that we're partnered with right now doing research on our platform. And they're doing everything from high-intensity interval training to sexual function to aircraft pilot enhancement. And I think this one's really fascinating too, economic decision-making and day trading. And we've seen some interesting anecdotes correlating HRV values with profit and loss on day trading. So hopefully that data is nice and robust. It'll be easy to sell things then. But yeah, this is an overview of our platform, which we'll demo wherever if you can find me if you have questions. Thank you.
Can you go back one slide and just talk about the wearable there on the right?
Yes, sure. So I mentioned hardware early on was kind of expensive and hard to use. Even when we first came out with our app, which was this look, it didn't look this snazzy when we first came out with it. We still required people to use a chest strap. So this is like a polar type chest strap. They're pretty affordable and accessible, but early on, our initial adopters were mostly fitness-oriented athlete types, and they all had these. As we moved more into the health space, and now about 50% of our audience is health-focused, people were not as enchanted with wrapping a wet strap around their chest early in the morning. And so we basically hoped that hardware would evolve faster than it did towards heart rate variability, but it didn't. So we're coming out with this device right here in about a month or so. And it's called CoreSense, and basically it's a sensor designed specifically for accurate HRV measurements. And so this it's a finger clip, which you would stick your finger in like this. It's not this big. And it has 3 LEDs that have multi wavelengths on top and bottom of your finger, and 2 different sensors that are calibrated specifically to look for that variation in beat-to-beat intervals. And it's not meant to be worn all day, all night, and stuff like that. And that's kind of the power of what we were talking about earlier, is that since we're able to take measurements so easily and frequently, we don't need to monitor 24/7. We can get 90+% of the benefit by taking less than 5 minutes of data per day. So you can wake up in the morning, take a 2-minute reading, and get 90% of the benefit of monitoring heart rate variability. And then you can just leave measuring like, we don't use our app for monitoring like risk of dying after a heart attack yet, but you know, then you would want an alternate solution. But yeah, this is called CoreSense. It's coming soon, and I've got a bunch of them in my bag that we can play with if anyone wants to look at them.
I think we have time for one question.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
That's okay. You answered it. I needed you to repeat the name of the product.
Okay, CoreSense. Yeah, CoreSense.
Okay, thanks.
Should we do one more question?
Okay, sure.
Anybody have a question?
Well, thanks so much. Thanks, everybody.